The scream came at 3 a.m. It wasn't human, and 3 days later, someone was dead. Welcome to Local Legends. Today, the Banshee. The night air in County Cork carries a particular weight in the hours before dawn. It settles into the valleys like something physical. Something you can feel pressing against your skin when you stand at the window and look out over fields that have been worked by the same families for centuries. The stone walls dividing the pastures are older than memory, built before anyone thought to write down who laid them or why they chose those particular angles. That specific height. Mist gathers in the low places where the River Lee bends, and the hedgerows, hawthorn and blackthorn, elder and holly, stand black against the lesser darkness of the sky. On nights like these, when the wind drops and the world holds its breath, sound travels differently. A dog barking 3 farms over reaches you as clearly as if it stood in your own yard. The lowing of cattle carries across the fields with an almost physical presence. And sometimes, rarely, when the conditions align in ways no meteorologist has ever adequately explained, you hear something else. A cry, a keen, a wail that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, rising and falling with a cadence that feels less like human grief, and more like the earth itself mourning something it has not yet lost. Those who have heard it. And there are more than you might think. Even now, even in an age of smartphones and satellite internet, reaching into the most remote townlands, describe it in remarkably similar terms. Not a scream. Exactly. Not quite singing. Something in between. Something that makes your chest tighten and your breath catch. That pulls at something deep in your ancestry. In the place where your grandmother's grandmother's voice still echoes. With warnings you've half forgotten. The sound of the bean, Svatha. The woman of the fairy mound, the Banshee. To understand the Banshee, you must first understand the land that shaped her. Ireland is a country built on limestone and memory. The island sits at the western edge of Europe, thrust up from the Atlantic like a last defense against the endless ocean. Its geography is one of contrasts. The flat, stone-pocked expanses of the Burren in County Clare, where limestone pavement splits into geometric patterns, and rare Arctic alpine flowers grow in the fissures. The dark peaks of the McGillicuddy's Reeks in Kerry, rising above glacier, carved valleys. The Drumlin Belt across the Midlands, those low rounded hills left behind by retreating ice sheets, creating a landscape of swells and hollows, of hidden places and sudden vistas. But, more than any physical feature, Ireland is a country of thresholds. The cliffs where land meets sea, the bogs where solid ground dissolves into water, the ring forts and passage tombs that mark the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the Esfete. The other world, the realm of spirits and ancient powers that existed long before Christianity arrived on Irish shores. These are liminal spaces, places where the ordinary rules do not quite apply, where the barrier between what is and what might be grows thin enough to pass through. The people who have lived on this island for millennia, the Gaelic Irish, descended from waves of Celtic migration, and earlier inhabitants whose names we no longer know, developed a cosmology as layered as the landscape itself. In the pre-Christian worldview that still echoes through Irish folklore, the world was never simply divided into natural and supernatural. Everything possessed a quality of net, a kind of spiritual power or energy. Springs and wells, certain trees, particular hills. These were not just physical features, but dwelling places of spirits, points of connection to the other world. The Sfeire themselves were understood as the remnants of the Tuatha Dé Fé Danann, the gods and heroes of Irish mythology who, according to legend, retreated into the hollow hills when the Milesians, the ancestors of the modern Irish, came to the island. They did not disappear. They simply moved to a parallel realm, one that occasionally intersected with the human world at certain times and places. Samhain, the end of the harvest season and beginning of winter, was one such time. Certain locations, fairy forts, ancient burial mounds, standing stones, were permanent points of connection. Into this cosmology, the Banshee fit as a particular kind of spirit, associated not with place, but with lineage. She was attached to certain families, the old Gaelic noble houses whose genealogies stretched back into mythology itself. The O'Neills descended from Niall of the Nine Hostages, the O'Briens of Thomond, whose ancestor Brian Boru died breaking the Viking power at Clontarf, the O'Gradis, the O'Connors, the O'Loughlyns, the Kavanaghs. The presence of a Banshee marked a family's legitimacy, their deep roots in the Irish past. She was, in a sense, proof of ancestry, of belonging to a lineage that predated Norman invasion and English conquest, that reached back to a time when the island was its own world. The relationship between the Banshee and her family was not one of malevolence. This is crucial to understand. She did not bring death. She announced it. She mourned in advance. Her wail was a warning, yes, but also a form of honoring, a recognition that someone of significance, someone whose blood carried the weight of centuries, was about to leave the world. In a culture where genealogy mattered profoundly, where your place in the social order was determined by how many generations back you could trace your lineage, the presence of a Banshee was almost a mark of distinction. To have a Banshee meant you were someone worth mourning. This understanding was shaped by the lived reality of Irish life for centuries. Death was not distant or sanitized. It happened at home. The wake was not a funeral home gathering, but a household event, with the body laid out in the best room, neighbors arriving to keep vigil, stories told, prayers said, tobacco smoked, and before the wake, before the death itself, there was the keening, the ritual lamentation performed by women, often professional mourners called Bean Shawente, who would cry and wail and rock, giving voice to a grief too large for ordinary words. The keening tradition was ancient, likely predating Christianity in Ireland. It combined Gaelic poetry with vocalization that was part song, part cry, part something older than either. The Cowanade Keen would recount the dead person's lineage, their deeds, their place in the family and community. It was both deeply personal and profoundly formal, a way of marking the significance of a life and the rupture that death creates in the social fabric. Some scholars, examining the Banshee legend in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, suggested that the Banshee might have originated as a mythologized memory of these keening women. Douglas Hyde, in his 1890 work Beside the Fire, a collection of Irish Gaelic folk stories, noted the connection between the Banshee's wail and the ritual keen. Patricia Lysart, in her comprehensive 1986 study The Banshee, the Irish Death Messenger, traced the relationship between the Banshee tradition and historical mourning practices across different regions of Ireland, showing how the legend varied in details but remained remarkably consistent in its core function, announcing death, mourning in advance, connecting the living to the ancestral past. But to reduce the Banshee to merely a mythologized memory is to miss something essential. The people who reported hearing her, and the reports stretch from medieval Irish manuscripts to contemporary accounts posted online, were not simply confused about the source of a sound. They described something that operated by its own logic, that appeared according to patterns that had nothing to do with whether anyone in the household knew how to perform a traditional keen. The Banshee came when she came. She announced what she announced, and those who heard her learned, often within days, that she had been right. The Banshee herself appears in 3 primary forms, though all share certain core characteristics. Most commonly, she is described as an old woman, bent with age, wearing a dark cloak or shawl pulled over hair that is long, unkempt, and iron grey or bone. White. Her face is often described as deeply lined, with hollow eyes that may be red from weeping, or in some accounts, empty sockets where eyes should be, worn away by centuries of tears. This is the Banshee as ancient crone, as the living embodiment of ancestral memory, a figure who has mourned so many deaths across so many generations that her appearance reflects the weight of all that accumulated grief. In this form, She is often seen combing her hair with a silver comb, sitting beneath a hawthorn tree or near water, a stream, a river crossing, or a well. The act of combing is significant in Irish folklore, associated with both preparation for death, the laying out and preparing of a corpse, and with the other world. The hawthorn, called seach giel in Irish, is a fairy tree, one that should never be cut down or damaged, as doing so invites misfortune. To see the old woman beneath the hawthorn, combing her grey hair while moonlight catches on the teeth of her silver comb, is to witness something from a time before your time, from a stratum of existence where human concerns about mortality are background noise to older, stranger rhythms. The second form is younger. She appears as a woman in her prime, sometimes described as wearing white or green, colors associated with the Esfide. Her hair is long and flowing, her features fair, her presence almost luminous. But there is something wrong about the beauty. The eyes are too intense, too fixed. The pallor of the skin is too extreme, and when she opens her mouth to wail, the sound that emerges is not the voice of the living, but something else entirely, something that bypasses your ears and seems to resonate directly in your bones. This beautiful banshee is particularly unsettling because she violates expectations. In folklore traditions worldwide, the old crone as death messenger makes a kind of sense. Age and death are linked, and a wizened appearance signals otherworldly knowledge. But a beautiful young woman serves as a reminder that death does not discriminate by age, that the threshold between life and death can be crossed at any moment, that beauty and vitality offer no protection against mortality. Some accounts suggest this form of the banshee represents the family ancestor who first became attached to the lineage, as a guardian spirit, a woman who died young, perhaps tragically, and whose tie to her living descendants remains unbroken by death. The third form is regional to parts of the Scottish Highlands and Western Ireland, the bean, nigh or washerwoman. She appears at a ford or stream, washing bloodied clothes or armor. To encounter her is to see the grave, clothes of someone about to die. In some versions, if you approach her correctly, with respect, without startling her, and manage to get between her and the water, she is compelled to tell you whose death she is mourning, and may even answer 3 questions. But this requires courage most people do not possess when confronted with a spirit washing burial shrouds in a stream at midnight. Regardless of form, certain elements remain constant. The banshee's primary act is the wail, the cowin or cry that serves as both announcement and lament. Those who have heard it describe it as unlike any human sound. Though it shares qualities with the ritual keen, it rises and falls in waves, sometimes starting soft and building to a climax, other times beginning as a full-throated shriek that gradually fades to a moan. The sound can last for minutes or come in brief, sharp bursts. It can seem to come from a specific location or to emanate from the air itself, from the landscape, from inside your own head. The timing is specific. The banshee appears or cries out in the days before a death, typically 3 days, but sometimes as much as a week. She may be heard at night, particularly in the hours between midnight and dawn, or at dusk, another threshold time. She is most often experienced near the family home, but can manifest wherever a family member happens to be, which has led to reports of banshee encounters far from Ireland, wherever the Irish diaspora has settled. She cannot be reasoned with or bargained with. Her presence is not a curse that can be lifted or a threat that can be avoided. She simply knows, with a knowledge that precedes the event itself, that death is coming. In this sense, she operates outside linear time as humans experience it. Her mourning is not a response to death, but an announcement of its inevitability. The future, for the banshee, is already written. Some families report that their banshee has specific habits or signs. One Cork family insisted for generations that their banshee appeared as a woman in a green dress standing beneath a particular ash tree at the edge of their property. An O'Brien family in Clare reported hearing a distinctive pattern to the wail, 3 short cries, followed by a longer one, repeated 3 times. These details, passed down through family oral tradition, served as a kind of certification. This was not just any strange sound or unexplained sight, but their banshee, known to them across generations, as much a part of the family as any living member. The banshee does not harm the living. She does not physically interact with the world in most accounts. She is observer and announcer, not agent. Her power lies entirely in knowledge, and in the emotional weight of her mourning. To hear the banshee is to know that someone you love will soon die, and to carry that knowledge while being unable to prevent it. That psychological burden, the waiting, the watching for signs, the knowledge of approaching loss, is its own kind of haunting, more profound than any physical threat could be. The transformation or origin of the banshee is less about individual transformation, and more about lineage attachment and spiritual role. Unlike creatures such as the wendigo or the werewolf, where the legend includes a clear process by which a human becomes the monster, the banshee exists in a different categorical space. She is not a human who has become something else, but rather a spirit being whose identity is fundamentally tied to the concept of death, mourning, and ancestry. However, several traditions attempt to explain how specific banshees came to be associated with specific families. One origin tradition holds that the banshee is the spirit of a woman who died violently or tragically while feeling intense love or loyalty to her family. Unable to fully cross over to the afterlife, she remains bound to the bloodline, her maternal or protective instincts transforming into a perpetual vigil. When death approaches any family member, her grief manifests as the wail. In this version, the banshee is not malevolent, but caught in a kind of liminal state, neither fully of the living world nor fully of the dead, her existence defined entirely by her relationship to the family she watches over. Our second tradition, perhaps an ancestor rendered a service to the other world, or perhaps the family's founding bloodline included someone who was partially of the Esfidhe themselves. Stories of marriages between mortals and fairy folk are common in Irish mythology. In this framework, the banshee's attachment is hereditary and magical, operating by rules that predate human moral frameworks. She mourns because that is her nature, her function, the role assigned to her in the cosmic order. A third explanation, particularly common in accounts collected by folklorists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, suggests that some banshees were women who were been shawante in life, professional mourners, whose skill at keening was so profound that their spirits continued the work after death. Lady Jane Wilde, writing under the name Speranza in her 1888 collection, Ancient Legends, Mystic Charms, and Superstitions of Ireland, recorded several stories where a particularly gifted keening woman's death led to her transformation into a family banshee. The line between life and death in this telling is less a wall than a permeable membrane, and a woman whose life's purpose was mourning might simply continue that purpose in a new form. Regardless of origin, the banshee's role imposes certain rules and limitations. She cannot lie. When she mourns, death follows. This is not because she causes the death, but because her knowledge is absolute. Some accounts suggest the banshee can see the anam, the soul beginning to separate from the body, before the person themselves is aware of any danger. Others propose that she exists partially outside of time, able to perceive events that are fixed in fate, even if they have not yet occurred in the linear progression of human experience. The families to whom banshees are attached cannot dismiss or banish her. You do not choose to have a banshee. She chooses you, or rather, your lineage does. Through the accumulated weight of generations, some families speak of her with a mixture of fear and pride. Fear because her appearance means imminent loss. Pride because her presence validates the family's antiquity and significance in the fabric of Irish history. There are traditional protections and protocols for those who encounter a banshee, though these offer no escape from the death she announces. If you see her combing her hair and can approach her respectfully, retrieving the comb if she drops it, she may answer questions about the nature of the coming death. Who? When? How? But this requires extraordinary composure in the face of a spirit who exists to announce your worst fear. Most who encounter the banshee flee or freeze, and by the time they recover themselves, she has vanished. You should not interrupt her keening. The wail, though painful to hear, is a form of honor, a recognition that the dying person's life matters enough to be mourned by a spirit who has witnessed centuries of human passage. To silence the banshee would be to diminish the significance of the death itself. If you hear the banshee's cry in the distance but do not see her, you should bless yourself and return home immediately. Being abroad at night when the banshee is active invites unnecessary risk, not of harm from her, but of encountering other spirits drawn by her presence. The banshee's keening can thin the barrier between worlds, creating conditions where other entities might cross over. Some families developed rituals to acknowledge the banshee, while maintaining the proper boundary between living and dead. A bowl of milk left outside the door, a candle in the window, small offerings that recognize her presence without inviting her into the human space. These are not offerings of appeasement. You cannot bargain with the banshee, but gestures of respect, acknowledgements that she is fulfilling her role, however painful that role might be for the living. The banshee's association with specific families means that genealogical knowledge matters. You need to know if your lineage includes one of the names to which banshees are traditionally attached. This is why family history was so carefully preserved in Irish culture, why the genealogists and historians held honored positions, why the loss of the old Gaelic social order during the colonial period was experienced as a spiritual as well as political catastrophe. Without the proper keeping of genealogies, you might not know whether that strange cry in the night was meant for you, whether the death she announces might be your own. The banshee entered English, language, literature, and Western consciousness through a complex process of translation, interpretation, and often misinterpretation, beginning in earnest during the colonial period in Ireland. English and Scottish writers visiting or occupying Ireland in the 16th and 17th centuries encountered references to the banshee in Gaelic poetry and in stories told by Irish-speaking populations, but they struggled to fit the concept into their own frameworks. Edmund Spenser, in his 1596 A View of the Present State of Ireland, mentioned the Irish custom of keening at funerals, describing it as a despairable outcry and a barbarous practice. But he did not connect it explicitly to the banshee legend. His dismissive tone reflected the broader English view of Irish culture as primitive and superstitious, something to be suppressed in favor of English civility and Protestant rationality. The banshee began appearing in English language texts more frequently in the 18th century, often stripped of cultural context and reframed as a simple ghost story or curiosity. Writers emphasized the exotic and frightening aspects while downplaying the complex relationship between the banshee, family lineage, and Irish spiritual cosmology. The banshee became a spooky tale to tell around the fire, a sign of Irish credulity rather than a meaningful part of a living tradition. Thomas Crofton, Croker's 1825 collection Fairy Legends and Traditions of the South of Ireland, marked a turning point. Croker, an antiquarian with genuine interest in preserving Irish folklore, presented banshee stories with more respect than many of his predecessors, including details about specific families and regions. His work influenced the Grimm brothers, who translated it into German, bringing the banshee to a European audience. But even Croker, writing for an English readership, framed the stories as relics of a vanishing past, folklore that educated modern Irish people no longer truly believed, even as he himself documented numerous contemporary accounts. The Celtic revival of the late 19th century brought renewed interest in Irish mythology and folklore, but often through a romanticized lens. William Butler Yeats, deeply involved in collecting and publishing Irish fairy tales, included banshee stories in his 1888 collection Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry. Yeats understood the banshee as part of a complex web of Irish otherworld beliefs. The banshee became a symbol of Ireland itself, haunting, mysterious, tied to ancient bloodlines, resistant to English rationalism. Lady Gregory, working with Yeats at the height of the Celtic revival, collected banshee accounts directly from Irish speakers in the west of Ireland. Her 1920 book Visions and Beliefs in the West of Ireland included detailed testimonies from people who claimed to have heard or seen the Banshee. These accounts are valuable because Gregory recorded them in a period when many Irish speakers still maintained traditional beliefs. And she largely let the speakers tell their stories in their own way, with minimal editorial interference. Reading these accounts, you sense the Banshee not as literary device, but as lived reality, something woven into the daily consciousness of the communities Gregory visited. But the Banshee's movement into English language popular culture also meant distortion. By the early 20th century, Banshee stories appeared regularly in Gothic fiction and horror magazines, often detached entirely from Irish context. The Banshee became a generic ghost, a screaming woman whose appearance meant death, but who had no particular cultural origin, no connection to lineage or landscape. This genericization accelerated as Irish immigration spread worldwide, particularly to the United States, where second and third generation Irish Americans retained fragments of the Banshee legend, but often stripped of the details that gave it coherence. Some Irish scholars and writers, Sayen Fayes Fay, Ilib Fayen's 1942 A Handbook of Irish Folklore, published by the Irish Folklore Commission, provided detailed classifications of Banshee beliefs across different regions, emphasizing the regional variations and the specific family associations. Patricia Lysart's 1986, The Banshee, the Irish Death Messenger, mentioned earlier, Lysart's work demonstrated that the Banshee tradition was not a relic, but a continuing belief system, with reports of encounters extending well into the 20th century. The tension between preservation and adaptation continues. Irish people living in Ireland often express frustration with how the Banshee has been represented in international media as a jump-scare monster, rather than a complex figure rooted in specific cultural ideas about death, family, and the relationship between living and ancestral worlds. Yet the very fact that the legend has traveled so far, that people of Irish descent in Australia or Boston or Toronto still tell Banshee stories, suggests something in the archetype resonates beyond its original cultural context. Part of this resonance may lie in the Banshee's fundamental role. She is a death messenger who mourns. This taps into universal human experiences of grief and loss, while maintaining cultural specificity through the details of how she appears and why. The colonial and post, the SES, a test study in how folklore travels, transforms, and sometimes The historical record contains numerous accounts of Banshee encounters that, while impossible to definitively verify, offer insight into how the belief functioned in practice and how it intersected with documented events. One of the earliest detailed written accounts comes from the family history of the O'Briens of Thomond, recorded in the 17th century. According to family records, in 1640, multiple household members of the O'Brien estate heard a sustained wailing over 3 consecutive nights. The sound was described as coming from the direction of the family burial ground, but also seeming to surround the house itself. On the 4th day, word arrived that the head of the family, who had been traveling in Dublin, had died suddenly of an apoplexy. The timing suggested that the wailing had begun before news of the death could possibly have reached the estate by conventional means. The family interpreted this as confirmation of their Banshee's watchfulness. During the Irish Rebellion of 1641 and its brutal aftermath, the accounts from this period are fragmentary, filtered through English sources, that often dismissed them as Irish superstition. But the sheer volume of references suggests that the Banshee tradition intensified during periods of widespread mortality. This makes psychological sense. In times when death was omnipresent and unpredictable, the idea of a spirit who announced death in advance offered a strange kind of comfort, a way of organizing chaos into pattern, even if that pattern was one of inescapable loss. More detailed account, recorded by Protestant minister Charles Bunworth and cited by Thomas Crofton Croker, describes an event in County Cork in 1798. Bunworth himself was ill, and his family heard a sustained keening outside the house for several hours before dawn. Multiple family members went outside to investigate, but saw nothing, though the sound seemed to come from right outside the door. Bunworth died the following day. What makes this account notable is that Bunworth was Protestant, not Catholic, and from a family that had deliberately distanced itself from Irish traditional beliefs. Yet his family interpreted the keening as a banshee, suggesting that the belief cut across religious and cultural divisions in Ireland by this period. The Irish Folklore Commission, established in 1935, systematically collected accounts from across Ireland throughout the mid-20th century. The Commission's archives, now housed at University College Dublin, contain over 700 distinct Banshee accounts, ranging from brief mentions to detailed narratives, spanning multiple pages. These accounts are particularly valuable because they were collected using standardized questions and recording methods, creating a body of material that can be analyzed for patterns. Zone account, collected in 1938 in County Kerry, describes an event from approximately 1910. An elderly woman named Enfair, reported that she had been returning home at dusk when she saw a woman in a grey cloak sitting on a stone wall, combing her hair. Enfair recognized this as a banshee and hurried past without speaking. That night, she heard crying outside her cottage. 3 days later, her brother, who had been living in Cork City, died in an industrial accident. Enfair's account includes specific details. The banshee's hair was the color of rain clouds. The sound of the comb scraping through the hair was clearly audible, and the crying that night followed a specific pattern of 3 long wails followed by silence, repeated over the course of an hour. A 1952 account from County Galway describes a family gathering where multiple members heard a wailing sound that seemed to come from the bog behind the house. The family included a returned emigrant from Boston who initially attributed the sound to a natural cause, wind, an animal, something mundane, but the other family members immediately identified it as their banshee. The returned emigrant, interviewed by a Folklore Commission collector, admitted that the sound had been unlike anything he had encountered in America, and that when his grandfather died 2 days later, he had been forced to reconsider his skepticism. More recent accounts, though not systematically collected, appear in regional newspapers and online forums. A 1990 article in the Kerryman reported that a family in Tralee had heard unusual crying sounds 3 nights before a young family member died in a car accident on the road to Killarney. The family's matriarch told the reporter that the sounds matched descriptions of the banshee passed down through family tradition. A 2008 post on an Irish heritage website described a similar experience in County Clare, where a woman heard a wailing that woke her at 2 a.m. Her husband heard nothing. 5 days later, her father, who had been in good health, suffered a massive heart attack and died. She stated in the post that her maiden name was O'Connor and that her grandmother had spoken of a family banshee. The challenge with all these accounts is that they are, by nature, anecdotal and unverifiable. No one has captured a banshee's wail on audio recording equipment, with clarity sufficient to rule out natural causes. No photograph exists that definitively shows a banshee. The accounts rely entirely on witness testimony, and human perception and memory are notoriously unreliable, particularly when dealing with ambiguous stimuli in low light conditions and high emotion contexts. The consistency of the reports across centuries and regions is striking. The descriptions of the sound remain remarkably similar. The 3-day warning appears repeatedly. The association with specific families persists. The emotional tone of the accounts, a mixture of fear, resignation, and a strange kind of validation, remains constant. These patterns suggest that whatever people are experiencing when they report a banshee encounter, it follows a consistent template, one that has been remarkably stable across time. Several natural explanations have been proposed. The barn owl's screech, heard under the right acoustic conditions, can sound eerily human and might account for some reports. The psychological phenomenon of auditory pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random sounds, could explain how wind through trees or the cry of a fox becomes interpreted as a banshee's wail, particularly when someone is already anxious about an elderly or ill family member. Grief hallucinations, where the bereaved perceive sights, or sounds related to the deceased are well documented. It is possible that some Banshee encounters are actually this phenomenon occurring before the death, triggered by unconscious awareness of the person's declining condition. The sociological function of the Banshee belief also bears examination. In communities where death typically occurred at home, and where family networks were tightly knit, the Banshee tradition served multiple purposes. It prepared families psychologically for impending loss. It provided a framework for processing grief, and it reinforced the importance of family history and lineage. The Banshee in this reading is less a literal entity and more a cultural technology for managing mortality, a way of integrating death into the ongoing life of the community. But some accounts resist easy explanation. Multiple witnesses hearing the same sound when no obvious natural source exists. Wails heard before any family member is known to be ill or in danger, followed days later by sudden, unpredictable death. The emotional impact described by witnesses, not simply fear, but a specific kind of recognition, as if some deep ancestral memory is being activated. The question, ultimately, may be less about whether the Banshee is real, in a material sense, and more about what kind of reality she occupies. To the families who have heard her across generations, the Banshee is as real as any other aspect of their heritage, woven into their understanding of who they are and where they come from. She is, in that sense, a truth that operates independently of scientific verification, a reality that exists in the space between mind and world, individual and community, past and present. The Banshee's journey through popular culture reflects broader shifts in how Western media handles folklore, and how Irish identity has been imagined and reimagined over the past century and a half. In the Gothic fiction of the Victorian era, the Banshee appeared as a stock character, shorn of cultural specificity. Sheridan Le Fanu, an Irish Protestant writer working in the 1860s and 1870s, occasionally referenced the Banshee in his ghost stories, but usually as local color rather than as a fully developed entity. Bram Stoker, Bansigers, in his lesser, these early literary uses treated the Banshee as atmosphere, a way of signaling that a story was set in Ireland or involved Irish characters, but rarely explored the cultural meaning behind the figure. The Celtic Twilight movement, led by Yeats and Lady Gregory, attempted to reclaim the Banshee as a serious literary symbol. Yeats's 1899 play The Shadowy Waters includes a Banshee-like figure, and his poetry frequently references the Esfidhe and their interactions with the mortal world. But Yeats's Banshee was filtered through his own occult interests, and his vision of Irish identity as mystical and ancient, forever in opposition to English industrialism and rationality. This romanticized version influenced how later writers and artists imagined the Banshee, often emphasizing beauty and otherworldliness over the harsher, more grief-stricken aspects of the traditional figure. The Banshee made her American popular culture debut in the pulp magazines of the 1920s and 1930s, particularly in Weird Tales and similar publications. Stories like The Banshee's Wail by E. Hoffman Price, 1928, presented her as a generic horror monster, a screaming ghost whose Irish origins were mentioned, but largely irrelevant to the plot. This trend continued through mid-century, with the Banshee appearing occasionally in horror comics and radio dramas, always as a threat, never with the cultural nuance of the original tradition. The Banshee's most significant modern reinvention came in American comic books. Marvel Comics introduced a mutant character named Banshee, Sean Cassidy, in 1967, initially as a villain in X-Men number 28. Later reformed into a hero. This Banshee was Irish and could produce sonic screams as a superpower. But the connection to the Death Messenger tradition was purely nominal. The character's powers referenced the Banshee's wail, but stripped of all meaning. His scream was a weapon, not a lament, and had no connection to death prediction or family lineage. Marvel later introduced Banshee's cousin, Siren, the racer Rourke Cassidy, with similar powers, continuing the trend of using Irish folklore names for Sonic. powered characters without engaging with the actual folklore. The 1959 film Darby O'Gill and the Little People, produced by Disney, included a Banshee sequence that became many Americans' primary visual reference for the figure. The film's Banshee appears as a ghostly coach driver, leading a death coach, Si Feist Bodhar, accompanied by a shrieking spirit. The sequence is genuinely eerie and draws on Irish tradition more than most Hollywood productions, but it also flattens the complexity of the Banshee legend into a single scary scene within a largely comedic film about leprechauns. The Death Coach and the Banshee are related but distinct elements of Irish folklore, and their conflation in the film created confusion about which was which. Irish cinema and television have handled the Banshee with more cultural sensitivity. The 1999 Irish film, The Banshee, directed by Orla Walsh, presents the legend within the context of rural Irish life and emigration, treating the Banshee as a genuine cultural force rather than a monster. The 2011 Irish horror film The Inside uses Banshee mythology as a backdrop for a psychological thriller, weaving traditional beliefs into a contemporary setting. These productions, made by Irish creators for Irish audiences, demonstrate an understanding of the Banshee as a culturally specific figure with particular meaning within Irish traditions of death and mourning. The Canadian television series Lost Girl, 2010 to 2015, featured a Banshee character named Lou Anne, who appeared in multiple episodes, portrayed as a private investigator whose wail could kill. This version acknowledged the death association, but transformed the Banshee from a mourner into an assassin, a fundamental misunderstanding of the legend's core meaning. Similarly, the video game World of Warcraft 2.004 present includes banshees as undead monsters who scream to damage enemies, their Irish origins reduced to a vague Celtic aesthetic. More recently, the CW series Teen Wolf 2011 to 2017 made a teenage banshee, Lydia Martin, a central character across multiple seasons. The show is writers did more research than most, incorporating the idea that the Banshee predicts death and the association with keening. Lydia's powers emerge gradually, and her character arc involves learning to control and understand her abilities, rather than being simply cursed. While the show still takes extensive liberties, making Banshee-ism a heritable genetic condition and inventing mythology whole cloth, it at least attempted to present the Banshee as something more than a screaming monster, showing her as a guardian and harbinger, rather than a threat. The video game, The Witcher 3, Wild Hunt 2015, developed by Polish studio CD Projekt Red, includes banshees as an enemy type. Interestingly, the game's banshees are treated as a type of wraith with connection to the game's Celtic-inspired Skelly Giles, and the game's lore notes provide some cultural context, suggesting the developers did at least minimal research into the folklore source. What these various adaptations reveal is a consistent pattern. The Banshee's wail, the most memorable aspect of the legend, is preserved, but its meaning is transformed. In traditional belief, the wail is an announcement and a lament, something that happens to mark death, not to cause it. In pop culture, the wail becomes a weapon or an attack, something the Banshee does actively and intentionally to harm others. The shift from passive mourning to active violence fundamentally changes what the Banshee represents. Similarly, the connection to family lineage and Irish genealogy, central to the original tradition, is almost always lost. Pop culture banshees are freelance death spirits, screaming at random victims or attacking heroes. The idea that a banshee is bound to specific families across generations, that she represents a connection to ancestral past, and a validation of family significance, is too complex and too culturally specific to translate easily into global entertainment media that seeks broad appeal. Some Irish writers and artists have pushed back against these simplified versions. The 2014 anthology Blood and Water, an anthology of Irish fantasy, edited by Ellen Gilchrist, includes several short stories that present the Banshee in more traditional contexts. John Connolly's Charlie Parker novels, particularly The Woman in the Woods 2018, incorporate Irish folklore, including Banshee references with more cultural accuracy, treating Irish traditions as living beliefs rather than exotic set dressing. The trajectory of the Banshee in popular culture is thus a story of gradual diminishment, from a complex figure embedded in specific cultural practices around death, mourning, and lineage, to a generic screaming ghost to a superpower. Each adaptation strips away layers of meaning until only the surface remains. The wail, divorced from its purpose. Yet the fact that the Banshee continues to appear across multiple media suggests that something in the core concept remains compelling. The idea of a messenger who announces death, who mourns in advance, who connects individual mortality to ancestral continuity, touches on deep human concerns that transcend any single cultural context. The challenge for artists and writers working with the Banshee is to honor that deeper resonance while respecting the specific tradition from which it emerged. The Banshee endures because she speaks to something fundamental about how humans process mortality and memory. In an age where death has become increasingly medicalized and removed from everyday experience, where people die in hospitals rather than homes, where professional funeral services handle the practical details of mortality, the Banshee represents an older model, one where death is anticipated, mourned communally, integrated into the ongoing life of the family and community. The Banshee does not hide death or sanitize it. She announces it. She ensures it will be witnessed and mourned appropriately. In this sense, she is the opposite of the modern death. The death that happens behind closed doors, managed by strangers, discussed in euphemisms. The 3-day warning that the Banshee traditionally provides is particularly significant. 3 days is long enough to prepare psychologically, spiritually, practically, but not so long that the warning loses urgency. It is time enough to say goodbyes, to resolve conflicts, to gather family. In traditional Irish wake culture, this advance warning allowed families to notify far-flung relatives, to begin preparing the house, to shift into the ritual space of mourning. The Banshee's function, viewed this way, is almost pastoral. She provides the gift of preparation, the chance to meet death with readiness rather than shock. But the modern world does not want preparation for death. We want prevention. We want treatment. We want death to be solved, not accommodated. The Banshee offers the death she announces cannot be avoided. This is intolerable to a culture built on the idea that every problem has a fix, that every outcome can be changed with sufficient will and resources. The Banshee says no, some things are inevitable, and your role is not to prevent them but to meet them with grace. For the Irish diaspora, the Banshee serves an additional function. She is a link to origin. In Boston or Sydney or Buenos Aires, thousands of miles from the Irish landscape, hearing a Banshee story from your grandmother connects you to a chain of belief and experience that stretches back through generations. The Banshee proves your Irishness in a way that living in Ireland could not. Because she travels with the bloodline, she is the landscape made portable, the ancient world carried forward into the new, the whisper of Ireland itself saying, "You are still one of ours, even here, even now." This may explain why Banshee stories persist among Irish diaspora communities, long after other aspects of Irish culture have been assimilated. A third-generation Irish-American, who has never seen Ireland, who doesn't speak a word of Irish, who considers themselves thoroughly American, may still have a Banshee story somewhere in the family history, may still wonder if that strange sound outside the window before their grandfather died was something more than wind or imagination. The Banshee also functions as a boundary marker between rationalist and traditional worldviews. To believe in the Banshee is to accept that the world contains more than can be measured or explained by materialist science. It is to hold space for mystery, for ancestral knowledge, for ways of knowing that do not require reproducible experiments or peer-reviewed validation. In an increasingly secular age, where traditional religious frameworks have weakened, but the human hunger for meaning and connection to something larger than the individual self remains, the Banshee offers an alternative spiritual model. not asking for faith in doctrine, but presenting an experiential tradition passed down through families, validated by the testimony of those you know and trust. At the same time, the Banshee can be read as an allegory for intuition, for the knowledge we have but cannot explain. How many times have you just known something was wrong before receiving confirmation? How often does the phone ring with bad news in the hours after you've felt an inexplicable dread? The Banshee externalizes this intuition, gives it form and voice. She is the certainty of approaching loss made manifest, the way grief can begin before the death itself. How we sometimes mourn in advance when we recognize the signs, even if we cannot articulate what we're recognizing. In this sense, the Banshee is profoundly real without being material. She exists in the space between perception and event, warning and outcome, fear and acceptance. She is the sound of time itself crying out, marking the moment when a life begins to transition from present tense to past. For contemporary Ireland, still processing centuries of trauma, colonization, famine, mass emigration, the suppression of language and culture, the Banshee represents continuity. She is the proof that Irish culture survived, that the old ways were not entirely erased, that knowledge was passed down through the generations, despite every effort to stamp it out. The Banshee could not be banned by English law, could not be conquered by Protestant theology, could not be educated away by modernization. She persisted because she lived in oral tradition, in family stories, in the lived experience of people who continued to hear her wail over Irish landscapes, and in Irish households around the world. The question is not whether the Banshee is real in the sense of being a measurable, photographable entity. The question is whether the reality she represents, the inevitability of death, the importance of mourning, the weight of ancestry, the persistence of mystery in a world that claims to explain everything, remains relevant. And the answer, judging by the continued telling of Banshee stories, the continued reports of encounters, the continued presence of the Banshee in both Irish culture and global imagination, is yes, she wails still, somewhere, for someone, and 3 nights from now, or 3 days, or 3 generations, death will follow, as it always has. The Banshee does not bring death. She simply knows it. She mourns it in advance. She ensures we do not face it unprepared, unseen, unmourned. In a world where death has become invisible, the Banshee insists that we look, that we listen, that we remember. We are mortal, our time is limited, and someone somewhere cares enough to keen for us when we go. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore, myths, and mysterious creatures. See you next time.